By the way, the Santa Anas are here, the winds. And I believe that every time the Santa Anas arrive in the fall, we should read this Raymond Chandler quote. Some of you will know what I'm going to read from his collection of short stories called Red Wind. There was a desert wind blowing that night. It was one of those hot, dry Santa Anas that come down through the mountain passes and curl your hair and make your nerves jump and your skin itch. On nights like that, every booze party ends in a fight. Meek little wives feel the edge of the carving knife and study their husbands' necks. I told you, Raymond Chandler, anything can happen. You might even get a full glass of beer at a bar. Raymond Chandler, awesome. There are several books that are influencing these talks over the next few weeks, and if you read about Los Angeles, you'll recognize them. And I've mentioned some of them last time, but I want to mention them again. Southern California, An Island Upon the Land by Carrie McWilliams. We're going to dip into a lot tonight. Another one is a new book called The Mirage Factory by a journalist named Gary Christ. We're going to spend most of our time with that book on the Trickster night. I highly recommend this book, and it's in the bookstore. And I'm going to quote from it here. And in fact, as you'll see, each of the series, each of the talks has a quotation from a Los Angeles writer or a writer about Los Angeles. And this is from Gary Christ. Los Angeles emerged as a major city and one with a distinctive identity, as an obscenely wasteful but alluring garden in the desert, as the focus of the entire world's movie dreams, and often its moral censure, as the heliocentric mecca of spiritual seekers across the country. Can I get an amen? Where's Wendy? Wendy, I'm asking for an amen. She's not here. Okay. Continuing, every city can be regarded as an artificial construct, an audacious projection of human will, imagination, and vanity onto the natural landscape. But none was more artificial or more audacious than this one, Los Angeles. All right, so just to catch you up, to remind you, or to catch you up if you haven't been here before, here's what we're doing. We're talking about Los Angeles stories, and there are plenty of Los Angeles stories, as you know, but we're interested in the particular stories that have a mythical or mythological dimension. So I'm not talking about the falsehoods of Los Angeles. I'm not talking about New York writers writing about Los Angeles. There's a whole genre of that, you know, of New Yorkers writing, in the New York Times especially, and then LA writers responding. It's really funny. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about the stories that run so deep that we may not even recognize them ourselves as Angelenos, but they affect us. They orient us in this city of angels. We're talking about stories that mean more than the other stories. We're talking about city stories, meaningful stories in a city of stories that orient us, that, well, they just give us meaning as Angelenos. And again, I don't want to say this is obvious, because it's not, because I'm making this up. What I'm doing here is I'm taking a mythological frame. So what we're talking about in these series, at least in the first part, is what you would get in a typical undergraduate mythology course. What are creation myths? What are place myths? And I'm putting that frame on LA stories. And I think you'll see, last time it was great fun and very interesting. And I hope it's also pretty meaningful to you as a seeker in the city of seekers. So that's what we're about. Last time we talked about creation stories, and there's the great Calafia, for whom we are named, a black Amazon. And we talked about Los Angeles as being located in the imaginary from the very beginning, because Calafia does not exist in history. She's a character in a novel. And the Spanish who came here in the 16th century saw Calafia's land, California, through the lens of the novel, but that wasn't some romantic notion. That was a real thing. That's why we're in California right now, because myth became reality. Myth transforms history into nature, Roland Barthes says. We talked about Los Angeles and the symbolic, and we're going to talk about that some more tonight, about how it lends itself, the topography, for example, lends itself to the symbols, to generating the symbols that make up myth. One thing about myth as a type of speech is that it's symbol-laden. And Los Angeles is, well, it's a symbol generator, not just from the topography, but from the industries, one of which many of you work in. All right, and then Los Angeles, and as the mythological, the storytelling center of perhaps the world, certainly the country. We talked about Los Angeles as palimpsest, but you had a better metaphor. What was it? I forget. You wanted to talk about paint. What was it? It was paint. Yeah. So, but you get the sense of something being layered over. And that's every city. And again, we should always ask what makes Los Angeles different from New York or Omaha or whatever, because every city layers over. But you're going to see tonight, you're going to hear a thesis about how this layering over, this palimpsestic. You know what a palimpsest is? Do you remember those little cellophane? Am I too old to be telling this story? Those little cellophane tablets you would get, and you could write on them, and then you just lifted up the sheet, and it was gone. Thank you. Okay, good. That's what a palimpsest is. Something that's just written over and over, and what's underneath disappears or gets covered over by a layer of paint. The difference with a palimpsest is it's gone forever. With layer of paint, you can maybe cut through it. Regardless, we also talked last time about Los Angeles as the city of angels, and in the sense of angels being, hey Wes, can we get a little air conditioning? Do you know how to do that?
I believe I can do that.
Okay, thank you. I know you're an AV guy. I can do it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Santa Ana winds. Yeah, it makes it warm. We talked about Los Angeles as the city of angels, and not with irony, because angels are, their function is to be intermediaries. They exist in a liminal space between the everyday and the sacred. And I like that for Los Angeles very much. I think we exist in a liminal space, and as I said last time, I think the messages might be going the other way. Instead of hearing from the divine, we're shooting those messages out into the world from a sacred center. Also, if you think I'm full of shit about Los Angeles, which you might be thinking right now as I talk about the sacred center and shooting, feel free to call me on it. I don't want to be sentimental about Los Angeles, although I am. But I don't want to be here. I want us to be critical and find stories that are, in fact, true in the sense that they're meaningful. All right. So we talked about creation stories, and I told you some of the things that are common to creation stories last time. There are things common to place myths, and you know this. So, for example, one of the great place myths is Uruk, from the oldest text we have in the world, the oldest complete text, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I want to just read you this from Gilgamesh, and well, I could read you all of Gilgamesh. That would be awesome. But listen to this classic, old, ancient, the oldest hero story. But listen to the city of Uruk as a character in the story. This is right at the opening. And at the beginning, it's framed. Anyway, let's not talk about Gilgamesh. But this is Gilgamesh, the story. He had seen everything, Gilgamesh. He had experienced all emotions, from exaltation to despair, and had been granted a vision into the great mystery, the secret places, the primeval days before the flood. He had journeyed to the edge of the world and made his way back, exhausted but whole. He had carved his trials on stone tablets, had restored the holy Inanna temple and the massive wall of Uruk, which no city on earth can equal. Watch it switch. See how its ramparts gleam like copper in the sun. Climb the stone staircase, more ancient than the mind can imagine. Approach the Inanna temple, sacred to Ishtar, a temple that no king has equaled in size or beauty. Walk on the wall of Uruk. Follow its course around the city. Inspect its mighty foundations. Examine its brickwork, how masterfully it is built. Observe the land it encloses, the palm trees, the gardens, the orchards, the glorious palaces and temples, the shops and the marketplaces, the houses, the public squares. Find the cornerstone, and under it the copper box that is marked with his name. Unlock it, open the lid, take out the tablet, and read how Gilgamesh suffered all and accomplished all. There's no separation between the hero and the city. Think about that. Here's another place myth we know. Now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east, in Eden. There he put the man he had formed. The Lord God made all kinds of trees to grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden, and there it separated into 4 headwaters, excuse me, and it names the rivers, which includes the Tigris and Euphrates. And you know Tenochtitlan, the great Mexican city. This is from Bernard Castillo, a Spanish explorer with Cortez, recording what he saw when he walked in Tenochtitlan. It was so crowded with people that there was hardly room for them all, some of them going to and others returning from the city. Besides those who had come out to see us, so that we were hardly able to pass by the crowds of them that came, and the towers and the temples were full of people as the canoes from all parts of the lake. Gazing on such wonderful heights, we did not know what to say, or whether what appeared before us was real. For on one side on the land there were great cities, and in the lake ever so many more. And the lake itself was crowded with canoes, and in the causeway there were many bridges at intervals. And in front of us stood the great city of Mexico. How can we forget Zion, the ancient Hebrew land and city that was taken from them, especially in the exile, the Babylonian exile, where one of their psalmists wrote this. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our harps, for there our captors asked for our songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. And then the Dalai Lama about Shambhala. Although although those with special affiliation may be able to go there through their karmic connection, nevertheless, it is not a physical place that we actually find. Well, you can only say that it is a pure land in the human realm, and unless one has the merit and the actual karmic association, one cannot actually arrive there. Karen Brooks up here, second row. All right, so forgive me for reading so much, but I really like to give you the voices that are seeing cities like Castillo for the first time. Those impressions are really important because they're immediate, but they're also comparative to the cities and the knowledge of the cities that they've had before, right? And you get a unique snapshot of a city, a place myth, when that happens. Now, place myths are also, as you might guess, connected to creation myths. And as we saw last time, when we heard the Chumash and the Tongva and the land of Calafia and all the other creation myths are also about, well, they're place myths too, because you have to create a place. You're creating a place, yes.
Is that like a connection with the divine inside of us? How we
Absolutely.
create?
Absolutely. There you go. And so ultimately, all this is about us, right? So let's keep that in mind as we go through, because that's a very important insight. It's all about us. The Dalai Lama got to that a little bit, you saw. All right. So I'm going to get to the stories, but again, I'm talking about the myths and how to understand them first. And I think it's really important to understand this notion created by the Czech scholar Mircea Eliade, called the book is called The Sacred and the Profane. And his concept is sacred space and time. Now, we may come back to this, but for now, what we're interested in is sacred space. He says, and I think he's right, he's not without its issues, but I think he's right about this, that the creation of sacred space, and by implication the sacred city, or any city, frankly, is cosmos out of chaos. Now, we talked about this last time, how scholars of myth talk about creation stories very dramatically as they're creating something ex nihilo, they're creating something out of nothing, or there's this roiling chaos, whatever that is. I mean, I've always been curious about how you can use chaos to describe something, because if it's really chaos, wouldn't it be beyond description? Anyway, let's not get into that tonight. My point is that it doesn't have to be chaos. It just has to be disorder, right? Something that's unordered. Those of you who are artists, who are filmmakers, who are writers, you know this. It's not chaos that you start with, or maybe it is if you want to be dramatic about it. It's really just the empty page and the perception of the empty page. And that happens with landscape too. That happens with physical space. You see something and you see it. Again, it doesn't have to be chaos. It just has to be unordered. And you imagine an order and you put an order on it. Well, that's the work of the gods. That's creating sacred space. That's creating a difference in the continuum, right? And so you have to, when you create sacred space, you have to mark it as sacred. So for Eliade, the sacred is different from the profane. And profane is simply a Latin word that means in front of the temple, profanum, in front of the temple. So you have the temple and what's in front of the temple. That's the difference within the spatial continuum, right? In front of the temple, you're in the world of the mundane, the everyday, the profane. He really means mundane. He doesn't mean profane as in sacrilegious. He just means mundane. But you cross into the temple, and now you're in sacred space. And we use this a lot. We actually should talk about this a lot more, sacred space and time. We use it all the time. I was on jury duty today, and so I went into the courthouse. Well, that was sacred space. You know how I know? Because there are different rules. Sacred space always has different rules. They're usually arbitrary. They're not logical. And you must follow them, or you'll get chastised by the judge. Trust me. A basketball court, a football field, a soccer field, a theater. We had this magnificent performance happening here Wednesday night, where our courtyard became sacred space. Is Michael here tonight? I don't see him. I don't know if you saw this. There was an image in the trailer. Michael took a piece of black canvas, and Frank fixed up a rig where he could hang basically a paint bucket, and Michael took the paint bucket and threw it out, and it started doing these concentric circles. And I was tired, and when you're putting something like this on, you're worrying about the logistics. And, everybody else, we had over 100 people. Everybody else had driven here, and, it was parking, and all that went away. As 100+ people, Angelinos, sat and watched paint dry. Sacred space and time. Those of us here talked about how it affected us, and it was affecting. It was a ritual. Rituals take place in sacred space and time. This creation of a sacred space usually involves some sort of axis mundi. This is the spire of the cathedral or something like that. I think you know what I'm talking about. It's the center of the world. So Black Elk goes up to Harney Peak in South Dakota, and it's quite a hike. I've done it. And he looks out over the Black Hills, and he says, "This is the center of the world." And it is. It absolutely is. Because it's the center of your sacred space. Ancient Hebrews had the temple, or first they had the tabernacle, and then the temple, and they had, the temple. This was sacred space, this wasn't. But there was a center within the space, the holiest of holies, which was even more restrictive in terms of participation and ritual and time and all that. So there are these concentric centers of sacred space, and what it does is, what they all do is mark the other. That is, what's not sacred, what's profane, right? So sacred space is always marked. There's a continuum of sacredness within the space. There's an axis mundi. There's some sort of center. It doesn't have to be phallic, like a steeple. It can be ionic, like a fountain or something. And it's about marking this space versus an other space. Now, if we think about that in terms of Los Angeles, I think that's pretty interesting. By the way, anybody know where the title of that slide comes from? T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. This is Gary Christ again. The Mirage Factory. It was no sensible place to build a great city. This corner of Southern California, often bone dry, lacking a natural harbor, and isolated from the rest of the country by expansive deserts and rugged mountain ranges, offered few of the inducements to settlement and growth found near major cities and other places. The Spaniards, Chris continued, who first explored the region in 1542, declined to put down roots here for 2 centuries. Even then, in the 1700s, they sent mainly soldiers and Franciscan friars, we talked about that last time, to establish missions and convert the local Indians to Christianity. When the Mexicans took over in 1821, they settled the area a little more heavily, but still regarded it as a province, a hinterland, a backwater without the water. By the way, we're going to have a whole talk just on water. What's going on here? John Gast's American Progress is Manifest Destiny. That's a real painting. That's the painting of a myth of the settlement of the West, of which Los Angeles is a part. But like everything else with Los Angeles, it doesn't quite fit. Teddy Roosevelt, when he was here, said, "I'm not in the West, I'm west of the West." And yeah, think about that. I like that a lot. I think he got that exactly right. So we have to understand the settlement of Los Angeles in these terms. As the purveyors of Manifest Destiny would say, the inevitable settlement of Los Angeles, despite its obstacles of no natural harbor, no easy water source, etc. This is, let's talk about Carey McWilliams, the great Los Angeles writer, from his book in 1946, Southern California, An Island Upon the Land. I just want to give you some sense of what he says because he captures this so beautifully. He was still alive and talking to people who were here in the 19th century. Like he knew Charles Lummis, etc., Mary Austin, the poet. And so he did some really good ethnography. So first of all, we are Italy. In the 1870s, we are Italy. McWilliams, quote, "An urge to travel was in the air, a great pent-up longing for the bizarre, the novel, the exotic clamored for release. Unlike their colleagues on the eastern seaboard, the mid-American sections of the new middle class were intimidated by the thought of the Atlantic crossing. Italy, France, and Spain seemed forbiddingly remote. They wanted an Italy nearer home, an Italy without the Italians, an Italy in which they could feel at home, an Italy in which perhaps they might settle and live out their lives, their days in the sun." I find so much of what he says insightful and problematic. I mean, because some of it he's just making up. He doesn't have evidence for it. They're impressions, but they're very good impressions. Representing, he says, Mid-America's first contact with the exotic in environments. Think about that. Representing Mid-America, so the Iowans, the Plains, the Midwest, first contact with exotic environments. It's not surprising that some amazing enthusiasms, misconceptions, and exaggerations should have found reflection in the first popular impression of Southern California. It was the newcomers, the tourists, who taught Southern Californians the art of overstatement. Now remember, McWilliams is writing this in 1946. His ethnography is going back into the 19th century, so I wanted to see if you recognize some of the discourse of Los Angeles that goes back that far. The early tourists, he writes, could never quite decide how to label the region. Remember, by the way, the tourists are coming because of Ramona, this novel that was written by Helen Hunt Jackson and capitalized upon by the Chamber of Commerce to bring people here. They loved this novel. It was very powerful, analogous to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it moved people out here. And so he says, the early tourists in Southern California could never quite decide how to label the region. It was, quote, a Mediterranean land without the marshes and malaria. It was the American Italy, the new Palestine. Okay, now remember this is before 1948, okay, and the Jewish state in Palestine. The new Greece. That echoes Stephen Heller's comment about Alexandria. A geographical Pleiades, the land of the sundown sea. I still hear that sometimes. The land of sunshine, poppy land. I don't know what that's about. Poppy land? Thank you. Brooke is our bookstore manager and scientist, resident scientist. Okay. And thank you, Bress. The better Italy, our Italy, etc. I think he's kidding when he says this, but McWilliams says that this, well, because he puts it in quotation marks. He says the science of climatology was developed by these first tourists coming from the Midwest to the Los Angeles area. Here's what he says. The climate of this Western paradise was so novel that it gave rise to a new interpretive science of climatology by which its marvelous wonder-working propensities might be cataloged and indexed. He's not wrong. Elsewhere, the general, and think about this, elsewhere the general westward movement of the settlers, for them climate was regarded as a hostile element, and it would have been a fit subject for curses and wisecracks, but in Southern California, it became an obsession. We're not obsessed with the weather still, are we? It was also a panacea. And now I want you to remember this because you're going to see, I want you to look for these connections between the talks because they're there and they're really interesting. This is McWilliams again. After exploring Southern California at some length, Dr. William A. Edwards, an early tourist, concluded that its climate could relieve and possibly cure the following ailments. Incipient phthisis, this is P-H-T-H-I-S-I-S, P-H-T-H-ISIS. Let's not play around with that too much. That could go lots of places. Chronic pneumonia. This is all the things that our climate can heal. Just being here. Tuberculosis, disease of the liver, malarial poisoning, cirrhosis of the liver, jaundice, functional female disturbances, the organic ills of advanced years, I'm in touch with that, simple congestion of constipation, heptic catarrh, scrofulous affections, insomnia, and enlarged glands. Just come here. That's all you need. Don't need a doctor, just come live here in this sacred space. Scarlet fever and diphtheria, it was confidently reported, were unknown south of the Tehachapi, and epidemics seldom occur. The enthusiastic Charles Dudley Warner stated that, and I love this, diseases of the bowels are practically unknown. Congratulations. Children cut teeth here without trouble, and disorders of the liver and kidneys are rare. The Southern California Medical Society appointed a committee, of course they did, to list the ailments that could be cured by the climate. That's genius, right? That's just genius. And scores of booklets were published with such titles as, quote, a study of the riverside climate with suggestions as to its adaptability to cases of phthisis. So widespread, he concludes, was the enthusiasm for climatology that the enthusiasm itself was dubbed the California fever. You're so happy to be in Los Angeles that it's a fever. How cool is that? Yes, and some of the later real estate speculators said, we sold them the climate and we threw the land in. And that is so true. Again, from McWilliams, and those are some of the wonderful posters from the railroads that advertised, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, that advertised California. Absolutely gorgeous, as are the some of the orange crate box labels. Do you know what I'm talking about? These are gorgeous. All right, fruits and vegetables. In particular, the products of the soil loomed larger than life in the tourist reports. Now, these are tourist reports. I'm suggesting they're myths. They're making myths because myths make you do something, and it made people move here. One reads of tomato vines 19 feet high, of cabbage plants that grew 20 feet in the air, of strawberries so big they could only be consumed by 3 large bites, so of cucumbers 7 feet long, of horseshoe geraniums as big as small trees growing in the hedges 6 feet high, of a gold of Ophir rosebush in Pasadena with 200,000 blossoms, of a grapevine in Santa Barbara that in 1896 bore 12 tons of grapes. That's right, 12 tons, one tree. Of a squash that weighed 300 pounds, of daisies that grew on bushes as large as quince trees, and of lilies 14 feet high. It was also said in the 19th century that if you wanted to pick a melon in Southern California in the Los Angeles area, you'd better get on your horse. Now, I find this fascinating. I think you will too. McWilliams again. One of the primary attractions of Los Angeles, apart from the fruit and the healing nature of just being here, was the fact that there were no natural disasters. Oh, gosh. This would be a good time to introduce Mike Davis to our discussion, but here's McWilliams. Not only were miraculous curative qualities attributed to the climate, but Southern California was a land in which natural disasters were unknown in the tourist stories. There were no thunderstorms or cyclones or tornadoes, no snow, nor ice, nor sleet, and above all, no mud. I think you're leaving out some things. I love this 19th century language. It's so florid. The visible wrath of God, right? Where do you go from there? The visible wrath of God, wrote one tourist, is not to be found here. No one ever froze or roasted to death. Sunstrokes and frozen limbs were unknown. Again, so beautiful. The blast of the wild horn of the mosquito is forgotten music here. I kind of wish we still wrote like that. Isn't that great? So, what are we getting at? I think you're seeing it, right? And McWilliams eventually talks about it in his chapter, which is called, wonderfully, The Folklore of Climatology, is that we're getting to that thing about Los Angeles, right? That thing that we can't quite nail down, and we always fail with our descriptions about what it is to live here. It's what McWilliams calls an elusive quality. There was some elusive quality about the region that completely baffled the tourists. Now remember, these are Midwesterners from the plains and Midwestern states who are coming here. So what are they used to? They're used to the plains. I love the plains, but you know, harsh winters, brutal summers, not much to distinguish the landscape. I think there is if you look, but you know, it's no Los Angeles. There seems to exist in this country, wrote Emma Adams, a visitor from Cincinnati. Cincinnati, right? There seems to exist in this country a something which cheats the senses. Whether it be in the air, in the sunshine, in the ocean breeze, I cannot say. There is a variety in the evenness of the weather, and strange evenness in this variety, which throws an unreality around life. There it is, 19th century, an unreality around life. And not more, so far as I can learn, in the case of persons especially affected by climatic influences than those whose feelings do not rise and fall with the thermometer. It affects everybody, she's saying. All alike walk and work in a dream. For something beguiles, deludes, plays falsely with the senses. It makes only a trifling difference how close one applies oneself. The effect is the same. There is no awareness of the passage of the day in Los Angeles. In Cincinnati, I would have sensed the going by of 9 honest, substantial hours. But here I do not. 9 hours goes by. The effect she quoted was new and peculiar and wonderful.
Sounds familiar to descriptions of Holy of Holies.
Exactly. This is sacred language. This is the other space beyond the mundane. Remember, that's all you got to do is get beyond the mundane. Right. All right. So, wow, I've got to hurry up. There's so much to talk about. This is McWilliams. Anybody know this term, the hyper-reality is Jean Baudrillard? Yeah. It's the real that, I don't want to get into that. It's Jean Baudrillard, you can look it up. Undeniably, the climate of Southern California, coupled with the this is interesting. McWilliams is a historian, sociologist, anthropologist, philosopher. Listen to this. The climate, coupled with the severance of old social ties and traditions and customs by migration, works a change in the people who have come to the region. Surely human beings ought to respond as the fruits due to this climate, Julia M. Sloan wrote, in spirit as well as in body, and become a very mellow, amiable, sweet-tempered lot of people. I think they do. Even the culls, C-U-L-L, those who don't measure up, are as good as the rest. It is the land, 19th century, it is the land of the second chance, of dreams come true, of freshness and opportunity, of the wideness of out of doors. I love this. Under the calming influences, wrote Mrs. Daggett, my pagan intuitions grew hourly. Pagan intuitions grew hourly. Beneath the lights and the shadows of the prophetic mountains, his sacred language, analytical tendencies ceased. Possibly my creeds became unorthodox, but they expanded cheerfully each day.
So, man, these people are serious, though.
They're absolutely serious. They're trying to tell a story that makes sense of this new environment. Absolutely, which is hard. Language begins to fail you. You have to use language differently. All right, there's also the cult of the body he talks about, but I'm going to move on. But you will recognize the cult of the body. Again, 19th century, visitors from Iowa, largely, come here and they generate this myth. What happens, of course, is, as I mentioned last time, the railroad comes to Los Angeles in the late 19th century. The Ramona myth is going of the novel about Ramona and her lover, Alessandro, echoing this Mexican past that was kind of odd and non-existent, but doesn't matter because it existed like California in the mind of the novelist, and Californians came and made it real. How interesting is that? And then you get the boosters. So you've got these phenomena. It's not going to be long before the money men come, right? And we've got a new product to sell here. And sure enough, they did. This is from a book by Tom Zimmerman called Paradise Promoted, the Booster Campaign that created Los Angeles. He says in the 1-year period from February 1898 to February 1899, the Chamber of Commerce of Los Angeles distributed 127,000 pieces of pro-Los Angeles literature in Omaha, Nebraska. So you saw the tourists connect their experience to other sacred spaces, Palestine, Italy, etc. Now the boosters come in. Here now becomes the names they use to describe Los Angeles. Land of the eternal spring. Remember the timing here, late 19th, early 20th century. The home of contented labor, because the labor movement's going strong in the early 20th century. Where nature helps industry most. The metropolis of the Southwest. The largest city in the Western Americas. The progressive city of the 20th century. The wonder city of the United States. The climatic capital of the world. New Beulah land and the home of, and sun-kissed skies of glory. Whoa. Sun-kissed skies of glory. I'll give you $1 if when you go back east, somebody asks you where you live. I live in the sun-kissed skies of glory. I was going to talk about Olvera Street. I think you know Olvera Street down on the plaza. And you might or might not know this, that this authentic Mexican street and vending was a tourist creation in 1930. 1930. So I don't know if you talk to people who visit Olvera Street, or if you visit Olvera Street and you're like, oh, it's nice to see the Mexican past. No, it was created by a white woman who genuinely wanted to capture that Mexican past, whatever version, the more romantic one, no doubt. And to get the city to back her, she had to shift to a more American past. And she did this for the Adobe there. I don't want to get into this too much, but so she kind of made the Adobe one of those George Washington slept here places. So you make it American history instead of Mexican history. I mean, it's an Avila Adobe, so, you know, there were Spanish and Mexicans. Anyway, and then she decides, well, you know what I really need? I need to get all these people off this street because they're sleeping there and partying there. So let's create a Mexican street called Olvera Street. You can go there now and get some great Mexican food. All right, almost done. I want to touch on a couple of other books that I think are appropriate for our topic tonight. And that is Rayner Banham's Architecture of Four Ecologies. Anybody heard of this book? Really? You haven't heard? Oh, good. Okay. I love giving you new information and new stories. After this, you must go to YouTube and watch Rayner Banham Loves Los Angeles. Rayner Banham is a stuffy, well, he's not really stuffy. He's just a very British gentleman who came to LA and fell in love with it. And he was an architect and an urban planner, or I think he was an architect, and he dealt with urban planning and urban studies. And he just loved it. Now, what you're supposed to do as an architectural critic in regard to Los Angeles is look down your nose at it. This is what's de rigueur. He didn't. He was just so, I think he was just so tired of being in Britain. And he came here and he went, whoa. He was like the early tourist, right? So he wrote this book. He taught at UCLA. He wrote this book called Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies. And then he did this YouTube, I mean, it wasn't YouTube then, but it was 1972. He did this video where he comes to Los Angeles, a Brit who has never driven in his life. And you just got to watch it. He's just so kooky and fun, and he has a conversation, has lunch with Ed Ruscha, the great art critic and collector. And anyway, I gotta keep moving here. He says there are four ecologies in Los Angeles, and I love this because he makes the book, he doesn't divide the book up as books are normally chopped up. He does it as if you're moving through Los Angeles, because you're always moving in Los Angeles, right? So he says there's surfburbia. And I love this because he doesn't restrict it to Los Angeles County. It goes from the far edge of Malibu to Balboa Island in Newport Beach. This is surfburbia. He's not wrong, is he? Like, if there were no signs and you drove that, you wouldn't know there was anything different. You wouldn't know you were in Orange County or even, Newport Beach. Here's what he says. Give me a beach, something to eat, a couple of broads, 1972, and I can get along with material things, said a Santa Monica bus driver to me, summing up a very widespread attitude in which the pleasures of physical well-being are not material in the sense of pleasures of possessing goods and chattels. The culture of the beach is in many ways a symbolic rejection of the values of a consumer society. That's kind of interesting. A place where a man needs to own only what he stands up in, usually a pair of frayed shorts and sunglasses. And that's right, isn't it? I mean, you know these guys, these beach guys and women, who that's how they live. I mean, that's Venice Beach, isn't it? And then he says there are the foothills, so this area, taking the LA River just north of downtown as the starting point. The western foothills run from Silver Lake over Beverly Hills into the Palisades. To the east, they encompass Highland Park, Pasadena, Sierra Madre, and Monrovia. In the South Bay, the communities of Palos Verdes. Wait, what? How do we get to Palos Verdes? Doesn't matter. We drove on the freeway. And he says, this is what foothill ecology is all about. Narrow, tortuous residential roads serving precipitous house plots that often back up directly on unimproved wilderness even now. An air of deeply buried privacy, even in the relatively broad valley bottoms in Stone Canyon or Mandeville Canyon. Even more than the second-growth woodlands of Connecticut or the heathlands of the Quintus Charts. This landscape that seems to cry out for affluent suburban residences and to flourish when so employed. Now, architecture for ecologies does not stand up well in some parts. He predicts that it's in the foothills that the middle class will live. The plains of Id, wonderful. These central flatlands are where the crudest urban lusts and most fundamental aspirations are created, manipulated with luck, and satisfied. This is lust for subdivisions and suburbanization. It begins in the San Gabriel Valley, taking Foothill Boulevard east. Banham backtracks the march of suburbanization to its roots in eastern LA County in Azusa. He says the landscape here in the plains of Id are an endless plain, endlessly gridded with endless streets, peppered endlessly with ticky-tack houses clustered in indistinguishable neighborhoods, slashed across by endless freeways that have destroyed any community spirit that may once have existed. Sorry for those of you who live in the San Gabriel Valley. Furthermore, he says this undistinguished townscape and its underlying flat topography were quite essential in producing the distinctively Angelino ecologies that surround it on every side. We need Azusa and Duarte. We need them because they produce the other Los Angeles. In a sense, he says, it is a great service area, feeding and supplying the foothills and the beaches. All right, so the last one is Autopia. So remember, one of the things you're supposed to hate, Woody Allen's Annie Hall when he comes out here, and every other New Yorker who comes out. One of the things you're supposed to hate here are the freeways, and we love to hate the freeways too. Banham loved them. He loved them. Again, he's a Brit who didn't get out a lot, but he says these are one of the greater works of man. Imagine, I can see what he sees. One of the greater works of man. He admires the earthworks of the off-ramps as pleasant views for the surrounding suburbia, where the dream, the illusion still holds. Freeway land is the apotheosis of the futuristic no place that his beloved Angelinos are, according to him, perfectly happy with. He says, we like spending 2 hours on the freeway because it means we're not doing anything else. So maybe he missed some things. Okay, I don't know. He says it's only the visiting snobs who see a dystopia here. Let me give you his voice. The freeway system in its totality is now a single comprehensible place. I think that's right. It's it's an ecology, right? The freeways, doesn't matter which freeway. They're an ecology all their own. A coherent state of mind, a complete way of life. The fourth ecology of the Angelino. Let's see, what else does he say? The freeway system can fail. Traffic jams can pile up miles long in rush hours or even on Sunday afternoons, but these jams are rarely stationary for as long as European expectations would suggest. See, there it is. Let's see. Banham argues that traffic and smog, 1970s, should be of little concern to us because autopia, externalities and all, symbolizes the all-American values of democracy and freedom. The freeway is about the freedom of movement, the freedom of leisure, the freedom of choice. And just like in any democracy, the citizen driver has to learn democratic ways. Let people in, right? Driving is much like voting. Both are adult rites of passage that require discipline, consensus, and consideration of the other. Yeah, it's a remarkable book, and again, the video is just really funny. All right, one more, and that's, you may know this, Norman Klein's The History of Forgetting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I think he's using Carey McWilliams quite a bit. So you'll see things in this book that echo McWilliams. Now, it's its own book with its own very particular arguments. He says these losses we have in Los Angeles, where we've just forgotten our history, are like phantom limbs, that we haven't really forgotten them in some deep municipal unconscious. Okay? He talks about the social, I don't want to get into this, but because I'm running late, but he talks about the myth of the climate, which we saw in McWilliams, and he calls it wholesome hedonism. Myth of the freeway, where he's echoing Banham, the metropolis, and myths of downtown and renewal, where he talks about the community redevelopment agency and the whole story of Bunker Hill. If you're interested in that, I can tell you that story, how we got our new financial center by taking 100 feet off a hill and leveling it, wiping out significant groups of people in the process. All right, so an audacious projection of human will, imagination, and vanity, that is us, I think. It is an unreal city. These are the things that I'm seeing as we go through. It's a city, by which I mean, echoing T.S. Eliot, that it's a city that's not rooted in the past. It's a city that is rooted in its own imagination, starting from the Spanish novel in 1539 or whatever it was, to the tourism myths, to the booster myths, to the interpretations of Los Angeles like Banham's that are not what to say, they're not compared to New York or other major cities, London, etc., and come up wanting. Los Angeles generates its own story of itself and resists these others. We've seen this from the beginning, the embedded difference in Los Angeles. You heard it in some of the stories of the tourists. There's all kinds of people here, just all kinds of people who have come in these migrations, and that means something. That means something for a sacred city. It means, for example, that you don't get to dominate in terms of religious, even political outlook, really. Ideological outlooks get elided in favor of diversity. Axis Mundi, we have a center here. There it is in that famous, well, I think it's famous. I think that photo of LA captures so much. I think that's the sacred city with the library tower there. Fantastic story of the library tower, by the way, the US Bank Tower. That is our Axis Mundi, except it's not, because the architect of the library tower, the US Bank building, wanted it to be and deferred to it in print and architecturally to the Central Library, Bertram Goodhue's Central Art Deco Library. Here's a 72-story building bowing to an Art Deco building across the street. I love that. That goes to the concentric centers, to the centerless circle that is Los Angeles. You know the story of Dorothy Parker, who reportedly said that Los Angeles is 72 villages in search of the center. In doing my research, there's a Dorothy Parker Society here, and I found a reporter who asked her, did Dorothy Parker say that? And she said, almost certainly not. Doesn't matter, does it? Because it's a mythological description of the city that works, except there are centers, many centers, and the circle is ever widening. For example, I mentioned last time, I was shocked by this myself, but the population of Los Angeles County itself is greater than 43 other states. 43 other states. Our county is more populous than 43 other states. I'm kind of thinking we need more representation. There's also the other. Los Angeles is always about the other. The mundane, the profane can become sacred. It just depends on what story's being told. And again, I think this city is an audacious projection of human will, imagination, and vanity. And I don't know about you, but it is, instead of imago Dei, the image of God, I see Los Angeles as the image of me, except it's not about me, right? There's that off-centering that happens with it. I see it as me because this is where I want to be, but I want to be here with everybody else. I want to be here with you too. So it's a fascinating kind of double consciousness that happens. And I'm going to stop because my voice is failing and I've gone on far too long. Thank you for your attention.